I recently asked my subscribers to name any athlete, past or present, so I could make a video where I determine whether or not they are overrated, underrated, or properly rated. Before I begin, I want to state there's no real order to this. I just took what I thought were the most interesting suggestions. Let's begin. You Sold the Bag says, Paul Pierce. A lot of people have mixed feelings about him, but I think you're of the age in which you watched him for most of his career, so what do you think? Well, I think most people realize Pierce was very good and even great for a few years, but not in the upper echelon with guys like LeBron, Kobe, Duncan, Durant, or Steph. Remember when he allegedly shit his pants in a finals game, though? That was pretty funny. My verdict? Properly rated. The Tank 564 says, Gary Payton. Largely talked about as one of the greatest defensive guards of all time, but no one really talks about how his Supersonics teams fell short in the 90s. To me, Peyton benefited from playing before social media, so his playoff failures, as alluded to, are largely forgotten about. And he also gets propped up by MJ fans to be a little bit better than he actually was to make MJ's 1996 championship seem more impressive. My verdict? Overrated. Fragilistic Falconer asks, Paul George. His career has had so many ups and downs that I honestly don't know where to rate him. Well, I believe George was slightly overrated at times in Indiana and Oklahoma City, but actually since coming to the Clippers, he's become such a target for jokes and criticism that I think people actually overlook his talents a little bit now. My verdict? He's underrated, but still a playoff underachiever. Andrew Ramsey asks, Randall Cunningham. Always felt like a bit of an underachiever, but still broke the mold with his ability. Well, in his own words, Randall was pretty lazy early in his career and didn't really study. So it's fair to say he underachieved a bit, but I wouldn't say he's overrated. I think he's rightfully remembered as a good quarterback who had flashes of greatness but lacked the consistency to be a Hall of Famer. Verdict? Properly rated. Mordecai Shikari II asks, Dave Steve. He single-handedly made baseball viable in Canada and is arguably the most underrated pitcher of all time, and in terms of stats and performance was easily the best pitcher of his era. It'd be a travesty not to include him. Well, thanks to John Boy's masterful Dorktown look at Steve's career, his greatness in the 80s has been thrust back into the spotlight a little bit. As his videos outlined in great detail, Steve was robbed of several Cy Youngs, a possible Hall of Fame nomination, and a few no-hitters. He had a great porn stash too. My verdict? Underrated. Matabs asks, Maurice Jones-Drew. Man carried the Jaguars for so many years, but nobody ever talks about him anymore. Like in his prime, he was amazing. And I agree. MJD's first 6 seasons in the league all ranged from very good to elite. Unfortunately, he played for mostly shitty Jaguars teams and quickly fell off after 2011, but I did watch him play at his best, and he certainly was the real deal. Verdict? Underrated. Mr. Fuzzy Flippers asks, Kurt Warner. It's hard for me to say for certain what even I think of his career because he only played maybe 4 or 5 full seasons. Warner only played 4 full seasons, but in those years he won 2 MVPs, a Super Bowl MVP, made 3 Super Bowl appearances, including one with the terrible Cardinals franchise. Even in such a small amount of time, that's way more than most quarterbacks can say. I think he's a deserving Hall of Famer, but not an inner circle legend. Verdict? Properly rated. Olio. Lynn Swann. He's in the Hall of Fame despite only playing 116 games, never recording a 1,000-yard season, and only making 3 Pro Bowls and a first-team All-Pro. I agree with this. Swann is a great example of being in the right place at the right time. He had some memorable catches in the Super Bowl that live on in infamy, but does he deserve to be in the Hall of Fame with such pedestrian numbers? Not to me. Verdict? Overrated. The Menegatti asks, John Stockton. Lots of people think he is extremely overrated, and some people think he deserves more credit because of his records. Well, to me, John Stockton gets overrated by MJ fans to make his 2 rings versus Utah seem more impressive. I also think, in general, Stockton is overrated. He wasn't nearly good enough as a scorer to warrant the praise he gets. He was a very good player who played forever to accumulate massive counting stats. Verdict? Overrated. Den says, Vince Carter. His legacy is so interesting to me, and I feel like his career is so unique, as he had great longevity while being crazy athletic. Well, like Stockton, Carter played forever to compile massive counting stats, but unlike Stockton, Carter isn't viewed as a top 25 to 30 player ever. I think for the most part, people realize he was very good for about a decade, then hung on for way too long. No offense, Darren Hernandez. Verdict? Properly rated. Alex Von Holten. I'm curious of your opinion on BrianUrlacher. Bears legend, in my opinion, who seems to get talked about less and less nowadays. Well, Urlacher is obviously a great player, and his spot in the Hall of Fame was well deserved. He was excellent as a pass coverage linebacker, but he wasn't as tough in run support as he looked. That's just me nitpicking, though. Verdict? Properly rated. Yarnball G says, Bernard King, one of the only NBA players to ever come back good after an Achilles tear, player and was still an amazing scorer in the 1980s. Underrated in my opinion. King was an amazing scorer, that much is true, and it's also true he wasn't good at anything else and his teams usually sucked. If he played today, there's no doubt he'd be called a stat patter, but his best years came in a major market with the Knicks, and nostalgia is a bitch, so he's looked at favorably. Verdict: overrated. Matthew Nolet says, Wayne Gretzky. He's regarded as the greatest hockey player ever, but with Ovechkin quickly climbing on the all-time scoring leaders and McDavid being debated as equal or better than Gretzky, it'd be interesting since he played in a very different era. Look, I don't pretend to be a hockey expert, and I know Gretzky played in an era that was more offensive friendly than McDavid, Crosby, and Ovechkin, but come on, there's no way Gretzky can be overrated. His production is so ridiculous and he checks off every box imaginable. To me, he's rightfully seen as the hockey GOAT. Verdict: properly rated. David writes, Weselker. Dude did so much, and I don't think he ever gets recognized for what he was and could do as a player. Well, Welker will always be most remembered for dropping a shitty throw by Tom Brady late in Super Bowl 46. He never won a Super Bowl, and his replacement Julian Edelman went on to put up great playoff numbers. But yes, Welker was an absolute monster for a good 6 years in New England. I do agree that he's largely forgotten. Verdict: underrated. Borba Fat says, Gale Sayers could have been one of the greatest running backs of all time if his career was not cut short by injuries. Sayers' talent was certainly not overrated, but his career is. People like to compare him to Terrell Davis since both are in the Hall of Fame and had short careers. The difference, though, is that Davis had huge playoff success, whereas Sayers never made the playoff. Verdict: overrated. Left or Right says, love the concept idea. Thank you. I would like to hear your opinion on DK Metcalf, especially regarding his potential for a place in the Hall of Fame. Look, Metcalf's a good wide receiver who creates a lot of media attention thanks to his Dragon Ball Z physique. But is he a truly elite wide receiver on track for the Hall of Fame? Not to me. And now that Russell Wilson is gone, I think his stats will nosedive. Verdict: overrated. Bieber0209 says, Yadier Molina. He is either considered one of the best catchers of all time or one of the most average of all time, depending on who you ask. Either way, the man has been in the league since 2004, and in a sport like baseball, that has to mean something. Well, most Cardinals fans think Molina is the second coming of Johnny Bench and belongs in the Hall of Fame, but in reality, he's had just 3 good years as a hitter in nearly 2 decades. Yeah, he might catch a good game, but his offense just hasn't been there enough to be a Hall of Famer, in my opinion. Verdict: overrated. Jordan Munns. Bo Jackson. I was always mesmerized by the fact that he played pro in 2 different sports growing up. Well, much like Gale Sayers, Jackson's talent and athletic ability was off the charts and worth all the praise it receives. But I honestly can't think of another pro athlete who actually accomplished less that gets more attention than Bo Jackson. For Christ's sakes, he has fewer career rushing yards than Jim Harbaugh. Jim Harbaugh! Verdict: overrated. Ryan says, Chris Webber. So much of his career is overshadowed by unfortunate moments and mistakes, when in reality he was a fantastic player who had a Hall of Fame worthy career and should have a ring. I mostly agree with this. Webber never lived down the infamous timeout at Michigan and has since become a much maligned broadcaster for TNT. But even though it's not completely unfair to say he had some struggles in the playoffs, he did have a legitimately great run with the Kings, and he should have won a ring in 2002. Verdict: underrated. Suggested Tiger says, Hey Barry, I know this one may be an obvious request, but he definitely deserves to be on the list. D's nuts. No. Why would you say that? That is not funny. There are kids watching this. Grow up. Seriously, come on. The poetry god, Chris Paul. A lot of good counting stats and accomplishments for the regular season, but not as much playoff success as one would think. I like CP3 and have rooted for him throughout his career, but at this point, yeah, there's really no denying that he just can't be trusted in the playoffs. I feel like he's considered an all-time great, but not the GOAT point guard, which is pretty accurate though. Verdict: properly rated. Hayes Abdujale, I hope I'm saying that right. If I'm not, I swear to God I'm not doing it to be racist, I swear. Draymond Green. People tend to believe that he's either a Hall of Famer or a super overrated system player. I'm curious to see what you think. Well, Draymond will never be the first option, but he excels at everything else from passing to defense. Steph fans tend to downplay his skill set to make Steph look better until, of course, you mentioned the 2016 finals. Then Draymond missing 1 game is somehow the reason why Golden State lost 3 straight. Verdict: underrated. Legend Bugga. Derrick Rose. He had a great start to his career, but because of how fun he was to watch and how well liked he is, I feel that he's become pretty overrated. You're right, D Rose was incredibly exciting to watch, but I don't think he deserved his MVP, and I think people really overstate how good he was before injuries because of nostalgia. He was an all-NBA caliber player, but not the top 25 to 30 player ever that some people act like he was. Verdict: overrated. Dark Rayul says, Troy Aikman, not a Hall of Fame quarterback, pedestrian numbers that was carried by every other player besides himself. I don't completely agree with that. Aikman has been decried as overrated by fans thanks to his pedestrian regular season numbers, and it is true that as far as Hall of Fame quarterbacks go, his stats are lacking, but his playoff run from 1992 to 1995, where he won won 3 rings, is legitimately otherworldly amazing and largely overlooked. Because of that, I can't say he's overrated. Verdict: properly rated. Hello, I am cool says, Michael Vick. People have mixed feelings because of his jail time. Wait, Michael Vick went jail? What? But you can't forget how he changed the game, but what do you think? Well, Michael Vick is the Allen Iverson of the NFL. He's the most exciting quarterback to ever play, but outside of a year or two, he really sucked as a passer. I think people were just so enamored with his physical skills that they overlooked his massive flaws and his fragility. My verdict: overrated. Kevin Pilati says, Julian Edelman is a good one because he is regarded as a Hall of Famer, but his overall production is so overwhelming. Well, Edelman was drafted into the best situation possible for a tiny white slot wide receiver, but I'll be damned if he didn't take advantage of it. No, he's not a Hall of Famer like some say, but this motherfucker was always open on important downs in the playoffs. I can't say that's overrated. Verdict: properly rated. Sawyer is cool. Justin Herbert. A lot of people think he is automatically a future first ballot Hall of Famer who is already a top 5 quarterback, but in reality, he is a very talented but average quarterback who is maddeningly inconsistent, shaky against good teams, and has a losing record in the NFL. Look, Herbert might be the darling of the NFL right now, and people are still in awe of his physical skills, don't get me wrong. Herbert is great and fun to watch, but soon he will start feeling the pressure to win. On the other hand, I do believe Herbert is a great quarterback, and well above average. I believe that he will win a lot in his career, but then again, he is on the Chargers, so you never know. Verdict: properly rated. MILF Hunter says, well, what's a MILF? I don't know. Karl Malone. Even though he is always going to be an evil guy, he did ball on the court. Well, we all know Malone's a piece of shit, and in my opinion, he's the biggest playoff choker in history. I will say, though, his regular season career might actually be underrated, unfortunately. But I largely think he's properly rated until MJ fans act like he's as good as Kevin Durant or Steph. Verdict: properly rated. Scott Pantera says, Allen Iverson. People hold him in similar regard to guys like Kobe, Steph, and Hakeem, but I view him as a massively overrated chucker, similar whose only real claim to fame was his handles and his sound bites. I largely agree with that. Much like with Michael Vick, Iverson's culture impact is not overrated, but his play on the court was. He was terribly inefficient, and outside of 2001, his teams never came close to winning a title. Absolutely fun to watch, though, no doubt about it. Verdict: overrated. Cinnamamba says, Scottie Pippen. He gets underrated by people trying to prop MJ up and overrated by people trying to downplay MJ. Not really opposed it from the lease of being his own player. Well, like the question alluded to, Pippen really depends on who you talk to. He was a legitimately great player and an excellent second option who showed, when MJ was off playing baseball, that he could be a great first option as well. However, it is also fair to say that he wouldn't be as well known or has won any rings without Michael Jordan. In the end, I think the praise and the criticism balances out. Verdict: properly rated. Christopher Mercer says, Donovan McNabb. Love to hear talk about a former Eagle. Well, McNabb was my favorite player growing up and the reason why I'm an Eagles fan. As time has gone on, I think his career has been largely forgotten. He was really good to great for almost an entire decade. He just had trouble in big games, unfortunately, which prevents him from being a Hall of Famer. Verdict: properly rated. Chase Johnson. That name literally translates to porn star. Kevin Garnett. Elite player, but stuck with a bad franchise. I agree, KG carried a horrible franchise on his back for most of his prime before winning a ring just as he started to decline. He's a legitimate all-time great. However, he is fortunate he didn't come up in the social media era, or else he would have been destroyed for his lack of playoff success with Minnesota. Verdict: properly rated. Rock Wilkin. Kawhi Leonard. People have made the argument that he has 2 finals MVPs because of good situations rather than elite play. Well, for years, I was on the Kawhi is overrated bandwagon, and I still think he gets overrated when people try to prop him up just to discredit LeBron. But I can't deny he is an absolutely ridiculous playoff performer when healthy, which is becoming rarer and rarer. Thank you for blowing that 3-1 lead versus Denver. Verdict: properly rated. Your boy 73 says, I feel like Jerome Bettis would be an interesting one. I was never a fan of Bettis. He didn't run for much yards per carry, he provided nothing as a receiver, and he padded his touchdown totals with runs on the goal line. In my opinion, he does not belong in the Hall of Fame. Verdict: overrated. Daily dose of baseball. Derek Jeter. People say he's the best shortstop of all time, but if you look closer, he's probably the 7th or 8th best. He is criminally overrated, but I would love to see and hear what your take is on Jeter. Jeter fluctuates between being overrated and underrated. If he didn't play in New York, he wouldn't have had the career he had or be as famous as he is, but on the other hand, he was a legitimately great player and a deserving Hall of Famer. I think, similar to Scottie Pippen, the hate and the love evens out. Verdict: properly rated. The Steel Curtain. Tracy McGrady. T-Mac is a childhood hero to many fans and bloggers nowadays, so he gets viewed favorably, even though if he played in the social media era, he would have gotten hell for never winning a playoff series. He was an incredible talent and a great player until injuries hit around 2005. Verdict: properly rated. My name says Cristiano Ronaldo. As everybody knows, I'm one of the most respected soccer experts of all time, and I can confidently say Cristiano Ronaldo is sexy and definitely doesn't pad his stats on penalty kick. Verdict, properly rated and sexy. Busto 1299. Peyton Manning. Peyton Manning is not overrated. That's really all I gotta say. Verdict, properly rated. Mojo Reds. Devin Hester. Look, you might want to wear earmuffs for what I'm about to say. Devin Hester is overrated as fuck. Yes, he's the best punt returner of all time. Does that mean he belongs in the Hall of Fame? Absolutely not. He has fewer career touchdowns than Ted Ginn Jr. Special teams touchdowns are not worth more points than other touchdowns. Verdict, overrated. Lee Keebum. Hey, that is not funny. That is not funny. That is offensive, and honestly, I'm calling the police. But first, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Kareem's resume is so godly, it's impossible for him to be overrated, but I do believe, like most older NBA legends, he benefits from a lack of scrutiny that modern-day players face. He's widely considered a top 3 player ever, and I think that's appropriate. Verdict, properly rated. The Sports Stop W, Tim Duncan. Well, much like Kareem, Duncan's resume is so incredible, it's hard to say he's overrated, but I have constantly heard how underrated he is for years now, and it's honestly gotten annoying. The first half of his career is probably underrated, but the latter half of his career is overrated. In the end, it balances out. Verdict, properly rated. 7 Sinful Saints, Joe Burrow. Burrow is one of the best young quarterbacks in the league. However, I do feel he was getting overrated a little bit this postseason as the Bengals had their run to the Super Bowl. And in the Super Bowl, I felt he wasted some chances to close the deal. I don't think he's better than Mahomes, Allen, or Herbert like some people do. Verdict, overrated slightly. Cock Sneed Fartin. That is disgusting. Absolutely disgusting. Shohei Ohtani. Ohtani's talent is amazing. He is great for the sport of baseball, but still, thus far, he's had just one great season. I'm not going to say he's overrated, but there is pressure on him to keep it up. I believe he can. Verdict, properly rated. The 360 Nate. Babe Ruth, I would like to know your opinion, and on him, I think he's overrated. Look, I'm not going to sit on Babe Ruth. That would be gross. But I will say Ruth is in the same category as Wilt Chamberlain and Jim Brown. His competition was weaker than later eras. That's true, but his production is so ridiculous, it's impossible for him to be overrated, in my opinion. However, it is fair to wonder if he'd be as dominant in later eras. I think he would have been great regardless. Verdict, properly rated. Rams 2022 champ, OBJ. I was a huge fan of Odell when he first broke into the league, and he was legitimately incredible his first 3 seasons. However, since 2017, he's dealt with injuries, and even when he's been on the field, he hasn't come close to living up to his superstar status. He's a great number 2 receiver, though. Verdict, overrated. Coffee Black, Steph Curry. Steph Curry is not overrated until the moment his delusional ass fan base inevitably tries to put him in LeBron's class. I think he's a top 7 to 8 player ever and capable of blowing games open better than anybody I've ever seen. But his resume requires more context than any other all-time great, plus he's a massive front runner. Verdict, properly rated. HBG 313, LeBron. LeBron is a top 2 basketball player ever and easily the most hated player ever. He's not overrated. In fact, I would say at times it's the opposite. Verdict, underrated. Kyler Schmutzler. Tom Brady. Barry, you already know. Well, several months ago, I finally relented and called Brady the GOAT, and unfortunately, I still think that. I also still believe he's been otherworldly lucky in high-leverage moments more than any other all-time great quarterback to win as many rings as he has. Is it possible for a player to be both overrated and the GOAT? I say yes. Verdict, overrated, but still the GOAT, unfortunately. And finally, Michael Jordan. Surprisingly, nobody brought up MJ, but I couldn't leave him out. He's a top 2 player ever and was the clear-cut GOAT before LeBron showed up. I still go back and forth between him and LBJ as the GOAT, but at the same time, his fans act like he was flawless and never lost. Is he overrated? Not unless you think he's leaps and bounds above LeBron. Verdict, properly rated.